Hi, I'm Officer Troy Nico with the Advanced Training Unit. I'm here to introduce the second of 4 training videos in reference to the APD policy revisions that were developed in response to the McClendon Settlement Agreement. This video will discuss revisions to APD SOP 1-4, bias-based policing/profiling, and APD SOP 2-71, search and seizure without a warrant. At the completion of this video, you will be required to take a short quiz covering the changes to policy discussed in this video. Just as a reminder, you will notice that certain sections of the policies have been highlighted in green and red. The areas highlighted in green are sections that were in the previous version of the policy, which went into effect on November 29, 2017. The areas highlighted in red indicate new language that was added to the current policy, which went into effect on April 26, 2018. Now let's begin with APD SOP 1-4-3, the rules. You will note that this section is highlighted in red, and as such is new to the policy. This section deals with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public entities, which include the City of Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Police Department, to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals who appear to have disability, including people with physical disabilities and people with mental disabilities. By its nature, a reasonable accommodation may require providing an individual with an accommodation that would not ordinarily be provided to an individual who does not have a disability. Providing a reasonable accommodation under the ADA does not violate the provisions of this policy prohibiting bias-based policing and profiling. In those cases involving persons who may be affected by a behavioral health disorder or a behavioral health crisis, officers should follow the guidelines set forth in APD SOP 2-19, Response to Behavioral Health Issues. Officers shall not use arrest as a method of getting mental health treatment for an individual. Officers may take an individual to a mental health evaluation facility if that individual appears to present a likelihood of serious bodily harm to himself or herself or others due to a mental disorder, to enable a mental health professional to determine whether the individual meets the criteria for involuntary civil commitment. An officer may arrest an individual with a mental disability when probable cause exists that such individual has committed a felony offense or a misdemeanor offense involving violence that poses a threat to others. People with mental disabilities, including people who appear to be homeless, are free to frequent public places without being questioned or searched. Officers may not initiate contact with an individual solely because the individual appears to have a mental disability or because the person appears to be homeless. See SOP 2-71, Search and Seizure without a warrant. Unless an officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that a person has committed, is committing, or will soon commit a crime, people who appear to have mental disabilities, including those who appear to be homeless, may not be stopped, questioned, frisked, or searched for the purpose of investigating whether they may have committed a crime. Further guidance on this section will be provided later in this video in APD SOP 2-71-3A, Rules and Procedures for Approach. In those cases involving persons who have developmental disabilities, officers should follow the guidelines set forth in APD SOP 2-19-10, People with Developmental Disabilities. In those cases involving persons who may be affected by a hearing disorder or is speech impaired, officers should follow the guidelines set forth in APD SOP 2-18, Contacts with deaf, hard of hearing, or speech impaired persons. It is important to remember that providing reasonable accommodations to an individual with a disability does not violate the prohibition against bias-based policing and is in fact required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. As far as APD SOP 1-4 is concerned, there were no other changes to this policy. If there are questions about this policy, please contact me at the Academy. Now let's move on to APD SOP 2-71, Search and Seizure without a warrant. In section 2-71-2, which is the definition section, there were numerous changes to the policy, both in the previous version and the current version. Now let's look at some of these changes. In the definition for reasonable suspicion, there was a minor sentence restructuring which added clarity to the definition. In the definition for probable cause, new language was added. The language is the refusal of an individual to provide consent to search a person, premises, or items does not provide probable cause or reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Officers are reminded that they must consider the facts and circumstances of a particular situation when developing reasonable suspicion and/or probable cause. In the definition for field interview, new language was added which only adds more clarity to the policy. The definition of pat-down had language added that addressed searching property that a person has in their possession. It states, a pat-down does not allow a search of items an individual may be carrying, such as a backpack, purse, or other items, or an item that an individual may be pushing or pulling, such as a shopping cart. In reviewing the definition of consent, you will note new language which states, consent shall not be found to be voluntary if determined to be a result of the use of threats, force, or coercion to obtain consent. Also, certain individuals, such as those that have mental disability, may be found not to be capable of giving consent. Please make sure to consider this when attempting to get consent from an individual. In the next definition, the word immediate was added to exigent circumstances when describing the officer's actions. In the definition of community caretaker or welfare check, there was language added to the previous version of the policy as well as new changes to the policy. The definition states, an officer may stop a vehicle or enter a premises or curtilage without a warrant or probable cause when the officer has specific articulable safety concerns that an individual might be in physical danger or in need of immediate assistance. Such encounters must be done in good faith without the intent to investigate criminal activity or effect an arrest or detention. In those instances where an officer is conducting a welfare check on an individual based on a request by that individual's treating mental health professional or the individual's family, officers should contact a mobile crisis team if available. These encounters are not for the purposes of investigating criminal activity or to effect an arrest. The definition for emergency mental health detention and transportation was added to the previous policy version. There was also new language added to the policy. The previous definition was, an officer may detain and transport a person to a mental health evaluation facility without a warrant or reasonable suspicion if the officer has reasonable grounds to believe, based on his or her own observation and investigation, that the person, as a result of a mental disorder, presents a likelihood of serious harm to himself or herself or to others, and that immediate detention is necessary to prevent such harm. The new language is, likelihood of serious harm to himself or herself includes serious harm by passive neglect. Such encounters are not arrests, and the officer may not transport the person to a jail or other detention facility. Now let's move on from the definition section to the next section which I would like to discuss. That is 2-71-3. This is the rules and procedures section. There were minor language changes to the approach section as well as new language added to paragraph 2. This new language in paragraph 2 is, an approach as described above is not to be made for the purpose of running a warrant check, attempting to develop a basis for a Terry stop, or instigating an event that would create a basis for an arrest. In those instances where an individual appears to an officer to be homeless or to be experiencing symptoms of a mental disorder, this does not prevent an officer from assisting such an individual in obtaining medical treatment of the individual's choosing or from otherwise rendering aid to that individual. In the stop and frisk section of the rules and procedures, language is added to the previous version and is still in current policy. It is important to understand that a Terry stop may not be conducted solely because an individual appears to be homeless or to have a mental disorder, and a pat-down may only be conducted when the officer has reasonable, articulable belief that a person may be presently armed or dangerous. Let's move on to the next paragraph. In this particular paragraph, it discusses vehicle searches under the automobile exception. This paragraph had language added in the previous version of the policy. I would like to highlight one particular part of this paragraph which states, probable cause to believe the vehicle contains evidence of a crime or contraband. Please keep this in mind. And finally, in the search incident to lawful arrest section, the word must was added to section 1F as in Frank. This concludes this review of APD SOPs 1-4 and 2-71. If you have any further questions about this policy, please feel free to contact me at the APD Academy at 343-5000. Thank you again, and please be safe out there.